Grey Room, which founded in 2000, is a peer-reviewed academic journal published every 3 months, in print and online, by the MIT Press. Founding editors are Brandon Joseph, Rehan Martin, and Felicity Scott. But the founding actors resigned from the editorial board after issue number 50 and assumed roles on the advisory board of the journal. Since then, other talented scholars joined the editorial board. Our speaker, Lucia Allias, is one of them. Grey Room brings together scholarly and theoretical articles from the fields of architecture, art, media, and politics to forge a cross-disciplinary discourse uniquely relevant to contemporary concerns. Grey Room has positioned itself at the forefront of the most current aesthetic and critical debates, featuring original articles, translations, interviews, and academic exchanges. Grey Room's emphasis on aesthetic practice and historical and theoretical discourse appeals to a wide range of readers, including architects, artists, scholars, students, and critics. Lucia Allias is assistant professor in architecture history and theory at Princeton University. Her research explores the intersection of architecture and preservation with international politics in the 20th century, paying particular attention to how modern design principles combine with institutional ideologies in the construction and the destruction of buildings. She is an editor of Grey Room and a board director of Aggregate as well.
The discussion is triggered by the herbal citadel of fire. That is, thousands of Iraqi refugees were forced to move out of the castle, since the citadel was just admitted by the UNESCO and was planned to be built as a heritage. Refuge and refugees. Questions are raised here. Should they be separated from each other or not? Should they be responsible to the global heritage? And also, what is the criteria reason behind it? That's what the discussion is mainly about. First, let's look over the discussion outline. Allias is the author of the book, who set up the whole discussion. Professors and scholars from many universities come together to the round table with their own opinions. Allias herself also included. Besides, she is also the editor of the Grey Room, and in the end, to draw a conclusion, she used one of her articles from another book, which expresses her summary to the whole discussion. The first article is by Daniel Monk and Andrew Herscher. They introduce the historical understanding of global history and humanitarianism. Both of them state to give privilege to individual, but actually, none of them show respect to the relationship between them. This article soon became a target of the discussion. Then a few scholars make a discussion on it, and Allias also gives her own opinion in the article called "The criterion should preferably be used in conjunction with other criteria." In this article, she focused on the difference between culture as owned and culture as lived. She stands against the monetized machinery that Monk and Herscher just mentioned, and suggests us architects not to expand but to explode our comparative horizons. As a response, Monk and Herscher used another article to clarify their opinion. They try to explain that people may have misunderstood them, and their former article is only so-called via negativa. Finally, in Allias' supplement article called Response, Global Aglaphobia, she drew a conclusion of the whole discussion and raised 3 important questions. To what extent is the tie that binds people to nations the same tie that has bound modern architectural historiography to national narratives? Do the mobility of peoples and the mobility of architectural forms follow the same logic? And also, are these the only ways for architecture to participate in a global political imaginary? In this article, she introduced an example called the Nubia. The Nubia is a famous architectural form in the 1960s and 1970s. It has been famous because it's transnational in modern sense. A constituency forcibly relocated by national planners for several times. To some extent, the Nubia was born as a form of refuge, but also it is an important mediation of African culture. So now, let's focus on the first article, the new universalism, refuge and refugees between global history and water humanitarianism. There are two main lines in the article. The first one is about the transmission of the herbal citadel, and the second one is about the historical backgrounds and understandings. Within the first line, once there was a good expectation to separate refugees from refuge. Refugees were expected to be used to develop tourism and gain income. And in return, this income were expected to be used to improve living conditions of the refugees. But unfortunately, this turned out to be very unsuccessful. Within the second line, we introduced the concepts of global history and water humanitarianism. Global history focuses on monumental architecture, while water humanitarianism focuses on centuries of camps. Both of them emphasize local, emphasize individual, but instead of the relationship between them. They think historically, it is the local that makes it so-called a new universalism.
Responding to Monk and Hester's claim of disaggregation of refuge from refugee, Allias reinterpreted it as a disjunction of humanism and humanitarianism, or the split of monument buildings and people. She interpreted the relationship between architecture and humanism, architecture and humanitarianism, as humanists treat architecture as an object in the study of human culture, while humanitarianists see architecture as the shelter of human life. Her arguments are focused on two aspects. How did this split happen, and what's UNESCO's role in maintaining the disaggregation? We think she attributes this split to some of the international laws or ordinances, such as according to the human rights law, the individuals are guaranteed freedom of movement, while the building monuments are fixed to the site. But the law protects individuals rather than the displaced masses, which leads no instrument for the refugee group to appealing. According to convention, the site is protected because it contains culturally valuable objects, but not the human beings who live inside. She also thinks that the division exists before the financial-based humanitarianism voucher that Monk and Hester described, because the split ways that culture exists: culture as owned, culture as lived. She used the word heritage criterion 6 as the title of her writing. The content of the criterion is that to be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas or with beliefs, with artistic and literary works of outstanding universal significance. Parenthesis. The committee considers that this criterion should preferably be used in conjunction with other criteria, as she described in her article, where the comparative lines between history, law, and architecture has been continually on the verge of crisis is World Heritage Criterion 6. It is where all the tension, or say the connection between architecture, history, law happens. When we look into the 11 sites that only fulfill Criterion 6, we may think it may be too overwhelming with the human violence. Monk and Hester follow the violent history of human being in their writing, but there are many different ways of writing history. Different culture, people holding different political views would definitely write differently. So she suggested that we should not to expand but to explore our comparative horizons.